Suzanne von Richthofen had it all. A loving family, wealth, and beauty. There wasn't much Suzanne wanted in life. Still, that wasn't enough, and in 2002, Suzanne decided to permanently change her financial situation by getting rid of her mother and father. The von Richthofen family lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2002. Manfred von Richthofen was a 49-year-old engineer and an alleged relative of the famous German pilot of the same name. As a fighter pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, was notable for his over 80 combat victories during World War I. However, in April 1918, his airplane was shot down somewhere in France. His grandfather and the Red Baron were brothers, according to Manfred. Nevertheless, the Red Baron's direct family denies having any relation to Manfred von Richthofen, as they possess a detailed family tree. Manfred von Richthofen worked as an engineer for Dursa, a company that developed and managed highways in Sao Paulo. Marisa, his wife, was a highly qualified and highly respected psychiatrist. They met at the University of Sao Paulo in the early 1970s. After graduating from university, they moved to Germany to continue their studies. Marisa and Manfred were described as opposites, yet everyone agreed they were meant for each other. Getting along with Marisa was easy because she was outgoing and friendly. Usually she was the one who planned birthday parties for her children and dinner dates with friends. In contrast, her husband, Manfred, was more reserved and quiet. It was more relaxing for him to sit quietly in a corner, observing everything. Upon their return to Brazil, Manfred started working for Dursa while Marisa opened a practice. Marisa and Manfred's daughter, Suzanne, was born in 1983. They had their son, Andreas, 4 years later. Despite spoiling their children, Marisa and Manfred were quite discreet about their wealth. It was not their style to flaunt their wealth or throw lavish parties. However, something Marisa and Manfred did splurge on was their children's education. Andreas and Suzanne attended Collegio Humboldt, a German school in Sao Paulo. Collegio Humboldt is one of the most prestigious schools in the country. According to teachers from the school, Marisa and Manfred were very involved in their children's lives. In their everyday lives, Marisa and Manfred were down-to-earth, relaxed people. Marisa and Manfred had been wealthy, but that didn't mean they didn't work hard. They knew that they needed to work hard to maintain their lifestyle. Suzanne and Andreas were expected to exhibit the same work ethic as Marisa and Manfred. By all accounts, they did. Suzanne was 19 years old in 2002 and studying law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo. In addition to Portuguese, she also speaks Spanish, German, and English. Her personality was the perfect combination of Marisa and Manfred. Although Suzanne was outgoing, she was not the life of the party. Besides enjoying hanging out with her friends, Suzanne has recently taken up jiu-jitsu as a new passion. Jiu-jitsu focuses primarily on knockdowns, control, and submissions, and is a martial arts based on judo principles. She was on her way to becoming a black belt. Andreas's parents hired Daniel Kravanos, a 19-year-old student, to teach him how to build and fly model airplanes. Daniel and the teenager formed a mentor-mentee relationship, sharing their love of biking and video games. However, after Daniel and Suzanne locked eyes, everything changed. Suzanne was instantly smitten. In weeks, Daniel and Suzanne had begun to develop a passionate relationship. They were together constantly. He even started joining Suzanne's jiu-jitsu classes. At first, Marisa and Manfred didn't mind Suzanne and Daniel's relationship. They thought it would be short-lived. Daniel came from a low-income family and struggled to find employment. Suzanne was a law student from a wealthy family, so Marisa and Manfred were skeptical that their relationship would work out. Daniel and Suzanne proved them wrong when, instead of cooling down, their relationship intensified. Most of the time, Suzanne supported Daniel since he had no stable work. There were times when Suzanne begged her father for money for Daniel. After Suzanne asked him to buy Daniel a house, Manfred had to put his foot down. He told his daughter that she could spend her allowance how she wanted, but his fortunes were not yet hers. Although Daniel did not attend law school, he would accompany Suzanne on field trips. Daniel's bedroom was lined with pictures of Suzanne. Their relationship was obsessive. One night, Suzanne told her mother she was staying at a friend's house, but she was actually sleeping at Daniel's. Suzanne warned her friends to lie on her behalf if her mother called, but that night, things didn't turn out according to plan. When Marisa called Suzanne's friend's house to speak with her daughter, she found she was not there. Marisa and Manfred banned Suzanne from seeing Daniel following that incident. Marisa and Manfred only pushed Suzanne and Daniel closer by keeping them apart. Daniel brought out a side of Suzanne that she kept hidden from her parents. Whenever Suzanne was with Daniel, she felt free. Suzanne and Andreas also became friends with Daniel's brother Christian, who was in his mid-20s. The four friends enjoyed playing video games at the local internet cafe. It was rare for households to have internet access in 2002, let alone computers. They all had gaming nicknames. Suzanne usually played as Sue or Polar, Andreas as Raptor, Christian as Soldado Cat, and Daniel as Kamikaze. Upon discovering Suzanne and Andreas hanging out with Christian, Marisa and Manfred became increasingly concerned. He had a reputation in their neighborhood. Every time his dog walked on somebody's property, Christian never cleaned it up. After one neighbor had had enough, he carried the poop to Christian's door with a shovel. Then, in a fit of rage, Christian smeared dog poop all over his neighbor's car. The crisis between Marisa and Manfred and Suzanne's relationship with Daniel escalated in the spring of 2002. Due to Suzanne's obsession with Daniel, Marisa and Manfred offered to pay for his education. They thought maybe Daniel was worthy of their daughter and could use some extra support. Daniel, however, declined their generous offer. Being young and having fun, he didn't want to take on the sudden burden of school. When Manfred threatened to send Suzanne to Europe for school, she vowed to break up with Daniel. Although Suzanne had told her father that the relationship had ended, Daniel and Suzanne remained together. At the end of October 2002, Manfred discovered Suzanne was lying to him and that she had been dating Daniel behind his back. He didn't know that Suzanne and Daniel were planning a way to be together forever without interference from her parents. On October 30th, 2002, Suzanne seemed to be having a typical day. She attended law school and performed her daily routine as usual. Then, around 9:30 p.m., she drove to Daniel's house to get high on paint thinner, glue, and marijuana. Andreas had planned to visit the internet cafe with his friends at 10 p.m. that night. Suzanne offered to drive her brother there and pick him up. She even advised him to sneak out and told him to put his pillows under the blankets. If his parents checked on him, it would appear he was sleeping. He was grateful that his sister was helping him sneak out. However, Andreas didn't know that Suzanne and Daniel needed Andreas out of the house to carry out their deadly plan. While Suzanne was helping Andreas prepare to sneak out of the house, Daniel was gathering the weapons they would use in their plan. Daniel filled 2 hollow iron bars with wood and added weight to them. That way, each blow he inflicted on Suzanne's parents would be more devastating. Daniel and Suzanne drove to pick up Christian after dropping Andreas off at the internet cafe. Christian was eager to help his brother and Suzanne execute their heinous plan. Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian wore stockings and gloves to avoid leaving hair and fingerprints behind. While Suzanne disarmed the von Richthofen's alarm system, the brothers waited outside. She then tiptoed up the stairs to check if her parents were still asleep. They were. After that, Suzanne flicked the lights on in another room and indicated it was safe for Daniel and Christian to come inside. Christian and Daniel brutally beat Marisa and Manfred to death with iron bars in the early hours of Halloween night in 2002. The brothers expected their victims to die quickly, but that wasn't the case. Marisa began making disturbing moaning noises, scaring Daniel and Christian. One of them ran to the bathroom and grabbed several towels. They put towels over Marisa and Manfred's faces to drown out the noise. After that, Daniel filled a pitcher with water and attempted to drown the dying couple. Even though Manfred died, Marisa was still clinging to life. Suffocating Marisa with a plastic bag, they eventually killed her. From downstairs, Suzanne heard her parents' screams as they died. Eventually, all was quiet. Suzanne remained calm as Daniel rushed down the stairs in a state of panic. This murder was the beginning of a new chapter in Suzanne's life. She was eager for it to begin. The next step was to stage a burglary. Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian stole thousands of dollars worth of cash and valuables from Manfred's briefcase. Daniel placed Manfred's revolver next to his hand on the bed. After Suzanne and Daniel determined the house to look burglarized, they drove Christian home. Following that, they rented a hotel room and swam in the pool. Suzanne and Daniel left the motel around 3 a.m. to pick up Andreas up from the internet cafe. When Suzanne and Daniel pulled into the driveway after picking up Andreas, they feigned concern about the open front door. No one leaves their doors open in Sao Paulo, a city known for its high crime rate, particularly not someone as wealthy as the von Richthofens. At 4 o'clock, Suzanne, Daniel, and Andreas called emergency services. When the police arrived, Suzanne was frantic. She told the police she didn't know if her parents were inside the house. They may have checked on Andreas, and he snuck out and left the house searching for him. The officers walked into the house shouting Manfred and Marisa's names. As they made their way through the home, they passed the library, which was a mess. Manfred's briefcase was broken open, and papers were strewn about the room. They continued through the residence until they reached Manfred and Marisa's bedroom. Both of their bodies were inside, and they were dead. Detectives suspected the murders were an inside job right away for several reasons. The killer covered the victims' faces, which typically, but not always, means they knew their murderer. Many valuable items were left behind, making the detectives think the motive wasn't burglary. They heard about the housekeeper, who worked for the family and was fired. Allegedly, she threatened the von Richthofen family. After questioning her for several hours, detectives cleared her of any suspicions of the murders. Andreas did not take the death of his parents well. On the other hand, his sister seemed unfazed by Marisa's and Manfred's brutal murders. The detectives decided to look closely at Suzanne and her boyfriend Daniel. Within a week of the murders, Suzanne asked authorities when she could sell the house. In addition, Suzanne and Daniel showed an unusual interest in her inheritance. They had already made plans to spend the money starting a business. Suzanne's behavior changed at the funeral, and she played the role of a grieving daughter around her family. However, Suzanne celebrated her birthday at home with her friends just a few hours later, the same house where her parents were killed days before. Even though Suzanne behaved oddly, there was no evidence linking her to the murders. They couldn't arrest her because they didn't think she was grieving appropriately. Despite their efforts, detectives failed to establish a link between Daniel, Suzanne, and the murders of Marisa and Manfred. Detectives discovered that Daniel had a brother while investigating the couple. Christian came home with a brand new motorcycle while detectives were surveilling Daniel's house. A large purchase made them look suspicious, which infuriated Suzanne, who knew detectives were watching them. The next day, detectives asked Christian to help identify a suspect at the station. During the interview, Christian gave inconsistent answers about how he got the money for his motorcycle, but detectives had no choice but to let him go. Detectives then made their way to Suzanne to talk about her parents' murder to hear her side of the story. During the detectives' questioning, Suzanne held her ground until they discovered her one main weakness. On a bench near his sister, detectives saw Andreas was sleeping. If Suzanne did not confess what she knew about the murders, detectives would pursue charges against Andreas. Suzanne then gave a full confession to the detectives. It did not take long for Daniel and Christian to be apprehended. Brazilian law allowed Suzanne to remain at her home under house arrest pending trial. In July 2006, Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian went to trial for their brutal murder of Marisa and Manfred. All three were charged with first-degree murder. Neither Suzanne nor the brothers would accept responsibility for what had happened. Instead, they all blamed each other. However, according to the prosecutor, Suzanne was credited with masterminding the murders. Christian, Daniel, and Suzanne were found guilty. Both Daniel and Suzanne received 40-year sentences, while Christian received 38 years. Suzanne and her brother haven't seen each other since 2006. Andreas was committed to a psychiatric hospital in 2017 after experiencing a psychotic break. In the years since, he has been in and out of psychiatric centers seeking treatment. In 2014, Suzanne married Sandra Regina Gomes, another inmate who worked in the prison clothing shop with Suzanne. Sandra was imprisoned for murdering a child following a failed ransom abduction. After Sandra was released from prison, she and Suzanne divorced. She also dated a lawyer and expressed interest in becoming a pastor. They broke up in 2020. What do you think about the murders of Marisa and Manfred? Is Suzanne mentally ill or a cold-blooded murderer? What case would you like to see covered next? And don't forget to hit the bell icon and subscribe.